Be in the chair here until Ms. Fry, Dr. Fry comes. So I'd like to welcome everyone to meeting number 61 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage. I would like to acknowledge that this meeting is taking place in the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Now, pursuant to the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, June 13th of 2022 and Tuesday, September 20th of 2022, the committee is meeting on the study of safe sport in Canada. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House of Order in Thursday, June 23rd of 2022. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I would like to make a few comments for the benefits of the witnesses and members. Please wait till I recognize you by name before speaking. And those participating by video conference, just click on the microphone icon to activate your mic as usual, and please mute yourself when you're not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom, you have a choice at the bottom of your screen of either floor English or French. For those in the room, of course, you can use the earpiece. A reminder that all comments should be directed here to the Vice Chair. So in accordance with our routine motion, I am informing the committee.
Just a point of order, Mr. Chair. Could you confirm to us whether sound tests have been properly conducted and that sound is adequate for interpretation?
Yeah, that's what I was just doing. Okay. So you're filling in for Mr. Shampoo?
Yes.
We don't have a notification. It has not been sent. Okay, just let me finish here, and you guys in the block can get the notification to the clerk. So I'd like to welcome our witnesses, and thank you to the Honourable Thomas Albert Cromwell, the Senior Counsel of Borden Ladner Gervais LLP by video conference. And I noticed, Mr. Cromwell, you're in the West Coast, so it's 3 hours, I believe. So good morning out in the West Coast. With you today, Nadia Effendi, the partner of Borden Ladner Gervais LLP, also by video conference, and Victoria Prince, who is partner also of Borden Ladner Gervais LLP by video conference. So the Honourable Cromwell, you have the floor for up to 5 minutes if you wish. And I know you have opening statements, and after that we'll go around the room with several questions on your report. So the floor is yours, Honourable Thomas Cromwell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair, and I'll be very, very brief in my opening. It's
an honor to be invited to today's meeting. I hope I will be able to help you in your important work.
Two things in order to preserve as much time as possible for your questions. First, as you've noted, I simply wanted to also note the presence of my two colleagues who I've asked to join me this morning in order to assist me in providing you with the information that you require. Madame Victoria Prince, elle est responsable.
Victoria Prince is responsible for nonprofit and charitable organizations, and Nadia Effendi also works at Borden Ladner with me. They have helped me in revising the governance, and we're part of the team.
About solicitor-client privilege that I hope will put everyone's mind at rest on that subject. My engagement with Hockey Canada was to perform an independent and impartial governance review, as the terms of reference refer to it, an assessment of Hockey Canada's current governance models and practices. Our 3 reports have been made public. In those circumstances, I'm of the view that there is no concern about solicitor-client privilege in relation to my review in testifying before you this morning. And I can also confirm that Hockey Canada has indicated its agreement with my view. With that introduction, just let me reiterate that I'm here to assist you as much as I can based on the governance review that I conducted. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Honourable Cromwell. We'll start first with the Conservatives, going for 6 minutes. And we will start with Mrs. Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cromwell, for being with us here today. And I'll start off with just a really basic question, and that is, it's my understanding that you were hired by Hockey Canada to do a review. Specifically, you were asked to look at their use of the National Equity Fund. Upon reviewing documents that were provided from Hockey Canada, you discovered that there was actually a second and third fund, but that was not initially a part of the review that you were asked to do. And so I'm wondering if there are even more things that perhaps you found in your review that you were not actually given permission or sign off to disclose in your report.
Short answer, absolutely not. Slightly longer answer, if you look at point 5 of our terms of reference, I was invited in the area of governance to make any other recommendations for actions that the board of directors and senior management could take to improve confidence. Once we started to realize that the reserve fund issue went beyond the National Equity Fund, we felt obviously that we had to look into that, and we did, and the results you have been able to read.
Thank you. Justice Cromwell, would you say that everything that you wish to disclose is?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, I'm also curious, you make it clear in your review that it wasn't clear to you where money was originating from and where it was going. There seemed to be a lack of transparency and accountability. And so with money coming in and money going out and not having clear record keeping as to where money is originating or where it might be spent, and I guess I'm just curious then if there's any chance that public dollars could have been put into one of these 3 accounts or funds and then used to pay for sexual assault claims. Can we be assured that that was not the case?
I can't provide any such assurance. I did not perform any kind of forensic audit. I looked at the records that I requested to see, and we noted some specific instances where there was no documentation for certain expenditures that the public had been told had been made. On further examination, and for example, in one case, we found that the expenditure was made but from a different fund. So we encountered a few things of that nature, but I cannot stand before you today and say that I did a forensic audit. I wouldn't be qualified to do that.
So basically what I'm hearing from you then is that we can't actually know with 100% certainty that public dollars were not used.
I can't say one way or the other whether they were or they weren't.
But had proper record keeping been kept, you would have been able to give that assurance, could you not?
I think
I mean, if you can keep track of where money comes in and money goes out, then clear record keeping equals transparency, equals truth, equals a surety.
I think that question requires me to make a number of assumptions that, as you can imagine, if you've had a chance to look at the financial statements of the organization, it's complex, and I'm not sure that at the level of an audited statement, anybody could be sure where a certain dollar came from and where it ended up going. That was not my focus. My focus was on what was the fund used for.
But when record keeping isn't clear, it does cause question, doesn't it?
If there's an absence of consistency in recording, of course, and one of the things that I've recommended in the review is that there be clear policies about both the purposes and the use of funds.
Now, Hockey Canada approached you and asked for this audit to be done, and you were paid for by Hockey Canada, correct?
That's correct. I take exception to the word audit, but the assessment of their governance, yes.
Okay, the assessment. Now, I'm curious if in your assessment, did you find out when Hockey Canada became aware of the alleged sexual assault that took place in June 2018?
No, I did not. My task was to evaluate governance, and I think as you'll see from our terms of reference, specifically excluded from it was the handling of individual cases.
Okay. Now, Hockey Canada has been mandated by Sport Canada to join OSIC in order to have funding restored. Now, I'm wondering if, again, in your
1 minute.
Thank you. And if in your review, did you find any evidence that Hockey Canada wanted to join OSIC before this was mandated or enforced?
Very briefly, my understanding was that in the past, the organization had expressed some reservations about it, but my understanding is that attitude has since changed.
Okay. Do you know why those original hesitations existed?
I'm aware of the reasons that were stated by Hockey Canada, and they were focused around the suitability of some of the regulations and undertakings for their particular organization.
What wasn't suitable?
I'd have to probably check some notes on that. It seems to me that, going from memory, and my colleagues can jump in and correct me if I stray here, but it seems to me there was concern about the one aspect of the concern was the disclosure of financial statements, in the sense that it might invite claims if people recognize the size of the reserve.
Sure.
And there were a couple of other things that, frankly, I just have slipped my mind at the moment.
6 minutes
Mr.
is
Cromwell,
up. Thank you.
Thank you. We're at the end of
Thomas.
our time. Perhaps you could provide us with that brief, since you don't have your notes with you in front of you. Perhaps you could provide that in writing.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Cromwell.
We'll move to the Liberals for 6 minutes. Mr. Housefather.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Justice Cromwell, for your service to this country, and for your very excellent work that you've done on the Hockey Canada file. I wanted to start by asking you, what audience did you write your report for? It seems to me that you wrote it to be read by a much wider audience than just the people who commissioned it at Hockey Canada. Who is your audience?
I think I would put that, Mr. Housefather, is saying that the audience was anybody who wanted to know what I thought about the governance of Hockey Canada.
That's what I was thinking, and I think that was appreciated. At what point did you decide that you were going to go, and I think this is probably beyond the terms of your mandate, and advise the Board of Hockey Canada they should all not run again and they should resign?
I became concerned from a governance perspective that the organization might be facing almost an existential crisis. And as I know you're very experienced in these matters and probably know more of the details than I do, but the specter of what would happen to the organization if all of the current sitting directors resigned was, I think, to use a polite word, murky. Yeah. And I became afraid, on the one hand, that a precipitous act might be damaging to the long-term governance health of the organization, but that on the other hand, it was, I think, perfectly clear to any reasonable observer what had to be done. And so that is why I advised the sitting directors not to renew their term, not to stand for re-election, but not to simply precipitously all walk out the door.
No, I think that was very wise counsel, and again, I appreciate that you took that step. One of the things that I wanted to ask you was, I think there's a real misunderstanding that I saw out there in some of the media about the way you dealt with the NEF. For example, you answered the question the Hockey Canada gave you to say, well, of course, it's appropriate to have a fund for uninsured claims. I mean, that's obvious that it's appropriate to have such a fund if your claims are uninsurable. But you went on in your report to criticize Hockey Canada for how it operated the fund. You said there was no proper disclosure, a lack of controls or definitions on how the money was to be used. There were checks cut without proper internal disclosure and accountability, no receipts, that there was no record of the disclosure to members. Would you agree with me that you were not exonerating Hockey Canada in your report for how they ran the NEF?
I wasn't trying to accuse or exonerate anybody. I was trying to set out the facts, and I wasn't perhaps as succinct as I could have been. As the old thing goes, I didn't have time to write a short report. But as I say, I wasn't there to accuse or acquit anybody. I was there to study and assess the governance, and those were my conclusions.
Of course, I'm using criminal law terms that I shouldn't be using, but I think that what you discovered was a lack of accountability and controls in the way they ran the NEF. And so there's one line you added to your final report that intrigues me, and I'd just like to ask about it. I asked Hockey Canada at the last meeting about the section of your report where you found that the NEF didn't fund the player health and wellness programs that the organization claimed to its members in a memo in July 2022 that it did. You basically, in fact, in your interim report had mentioned this, and in your final report you added a line saying, yes, in fact, the NEF did not fund those programs. They were funded from the Health Benefit Trust, which was another reserve fund with its own set of governance problems that Hockey Canada had. And the timing of these untrue statements in July immediately followed the public revelations about the NEF, the meeting of our committee, the hiring of crisis communications firm, and in fact, the board minutes where they weaved a different narrative in terms of accusing the press of maligning Hockey Canada. And I was wondering whether you thought that this false disclosure in July of 2022 that the NEF had these other good purposes was deliberate, or was it just, again, poor governance and a mistake?
I didn't explore why the error was made. I simply tried to ascertain the facts about the use of the funds. I think it's also perhaps important just to note that the issue related to the counseling aspect of what had been included in the original memo to members that I believe, if I don't have it in front of me, of course, but if I were going from memory, the memo that went out to members mentioned a number of purposes for which the fund was used. And if you have a look at, if you happen to have the report handy or wish to look at it later, we have a chart on page 152 of the report, which page 165 dans la version française.
Page 165 in French version.
Or that certain donations to various organizations, such as telephone helplines and so on and so forth, were in fact made from the National Equity Fund. The point that was not made was the counseling fees, and we were ultimately advised that those were paid out of another fund, the Health and Benefit Trust Fund.
Thank you. I have limited time, so I'm going to ask you one short question, Justice Cromwell. Were you satisfied with how the nominations committee handled the recent announcement of their proposed candidates to the Board of Hockey Canada? Did you follow the process, and were you satisfied with the way that they did it this time, and did they follow your advice?
Let me answer that in two ways very briefly, if I may, Mr. Hessfather. The first is to say that I've had zero involvement in either the recruiting, selection, or nomination of candidates. And so I'm not close to the process. I certainly had no role to play in any selection aspect of their work. What I know about it is what I've read in the press, and all I can say is that it certainly appears that the nominating committee tried extremely hard to recruit the sort of board with the sort of profile that I recommended.
Thank you very much. We'll move on to the block. Mr. Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, Mr. Cromwell, I would like to add my voice to those congratulating you for this report. At the beginning, it was easy to be skeptical of a report on Hockey Canada paid for by Hockey Canada, but you did deliver something that will be constructive both for the hockey world and for all sports, so I sincerely thank you. It would have been somewhat hazardous if we had repeated the same situation, or if Hockey Canada had repeated the same situation, actions that brought us to this situation. You have a 221-page report that says that hockey is at a crossroads, and you suggested many avenues for solutions, including increasing the number of women on the board. Are you satisfied with what we learned yesterday about the board?
Je n'ai pas assez.
Answer. I do not have enough information, frankly, to be satisfied or not, because I am not at all involved in this process. However, according to reporting, it is clear that the nomination committee is trying hard to appoint members who are qualified and experienced in the various areas, which is completely in line with my recommendations. Question. You made recommendations about the constitution of the board. Do you feel that Hockey Canada will comply with Canadian sport rules?
Je pense que
Answer. I believe Hockey Canada has made an announcement to that effect.
Revalidé.
Question. I will check again. I don't remember seeing anything. Do you remember how the insurance of the Hockey Canada board was evaluated? And can you talk about why the costs shot up so quickly? Answer. I am not an expert in the insurance market. However, it seems to me that after the sexual assaults, the rates significantly increased. The result was that the insurance rates increased. Question. Is this comparable to other international sports organizations, or is this an anomaly to hockey? Answer. I'm not in a position to draw a comparison, but I'll point you to a table at page 163 of the French version of the report. I reproduced the various insurances. Question. In your investigation, did you discover that someone in Hockey Canada or multiple people benefited from the insurance? I'm not sure I understood the question. Did you find out that anyone in Hockey Canada could have personally benefited from the insurance funds and the way that the insurance contributions increased? Answer. No. Question. How can you explain that Hockey Canada's financial documents are still not available on its website? Answer. That is a choice made by the organization, and clearly I did recommend a different approach. Question. How can you explain that people who are seriously injured, even paraplegic, are not covered by insurance policies? You've heard of various cases in the media, I take it. Answer. I have no knowledge other than very general knowledge of Hockey Canada's insurance, and I have absolutely no information about why those individuals are not covered if that is the case. Question. So the idea that since a referee hadn't seen an injury happen on the ice, Hockey Canada didn't have to cover that player. Next question, 45 seconds remaining. Can you comment on transparency? Can you talk about partnerships with Hockey Canada? And overall, is it useful to Hockey Canada when it comes to insurances when they borrow hockey players? Can you speak to the way players belong to different teams within Hockey Canada? Answer. I have not observed any irregularities. Question. Regarding the various funds, is there a process to follow to ensure that the rules are respected? Have you looked into these rules and procedures? Answer: as you know, I recommended that the organization develop a set of policies governing the uses for these funds, and this contributes to enhanced transparency.
Pour le, excusez-moi.
Pardon me?
Yeah, sorry, Honorable Cromwell. We are well over our
Excusez-moi.
time allotment.
I beg your pardon.
Go to
Je vous
the
remercie, Monsieur Cromwell.
ND
Thank you, Mr. Cromwell.
Minister Julian.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Justice Cromwell, for your work on behalf of Canadians. As you're well aware, our committee has been seized with this issue with Hockey Canada governance, Hockey Canada's response to the most horrific allegations of sexual assault over the last few months. And we appreciate you coming and answering questions. I wanted to start by following up on the records and the mandate. Are there any records that you request to see that were refused to you?
No.
Or were there any
And
records?
Mr. Julian, I can tell you that had that been the case, I would not completed the mandate.
Were there any records that you requested that were non-existent?
Well, yes. As I noted in the report, we obviously wanted to see any existing policy documents concerning any of the various funds that we studied, and learned that there were no such documents. But it wasn't a matter of the documents were missing. It was, as far as we could understand, the documents had never been created.
Thank you for that. Were there any questions that you asked where you simply did not receive a satisfactory response?
No.
Your report was issued, final report was issued on October 31st. The current board, and your report recommended that the current board not reoffer. On October 11th, after the appearance here for the Heritage Committee, the current board announced that it was not going to reoffer. Was there any communication made prior to October 31st of your recommendation? Would it have been known to the board members on October 11th that you were recommending that the current board not reoffer?
No, I believe that my recommendation followed that appearance. We might have to double check the chronology, but the two operated independently in my mind.
Yes, no, I understand that, but is it possible that the board or some members within Hockey Canada were aware at that point that was your intent to make that recommendation?
To the best of my knowledge, they would have had no indication that was coming from me until they received it.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned earlier that your responsibilities did not include responding to specific cases, but we have these horrific allegations from 2003, from 2018. In terms of how Hockey Canada responds to these horrific allegations, the issue of how Hockey Canada handles sexual assaults or horrific allegations of sexual violence is extremely important. Are there any elements beyond your report that you can tell us as a committee that are important for Hockey Canada to do moving forward?
I think you'll see from the length of the report that I didn't leave too much out. So I can't think of anything that I felt was important that emerged from my review that is not referred to in what I've provided.
You mentioned earlier, and I've got quotation marks around you, so I hope I've reported this accurately. You said that there was concern that the issue of the amount of the monies available in the funds could And the quotation I have is invite claims because of the size of the reserve. Is that an accurate portrayal of how Hockey Canada saw the issue of governance and responding to these horrific allegations in a way that was not forthcoming to the public?
I think, in fact, you referred to the reference I was searching for in response to Ms. Thomas a few moments ago, that all I can say is that that was the explanation that was offered for the reluctance to disclose the size of those reserve funds.
And what is your response to that? I mean, certainly we've seen the response of the Canadian public, the sponsors of the provincial federations to Hockey Canada's, quite frankly, stonewalling on information of this nature. What is your response when you see what was an internal decision within Hockey Canada to try to handle these issues quietly rather than responding in a transparent way? 1 minute.
Well, I responded to that in many different ways, but I think two of the most important are, number one, having a clear and robust policy framework to deal with these matters and not deal with them as sort of ad hoc one-offs. And second of all, transparency is obviously important, and the COC code suggests that financial statements ought to be made public, and my view is that that is sound advice.
Do you believe that Hockey Canada should be releasing the victims who want or choose to do so from the NDAs that link them to the compensation that they've received?
I don't want to opine on that. I don't know all the facts, and I certainly didn't study that issue at all.
Thank you, Mr. Julian. We'll move to our second round, a 5-minute round. We'll start with the Conservatives and Ms. Gladue.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Justice Cromwell, for being here today. I'm going to be taking up questions with a view to trying to figure out how to close the loopholes in order to prevent this sort of thing from happening in the future. Now, as a professional engineer that traveled globally and worked for national and global organizations, in every organization there would have been a governance description that would have a code of conduct, HR procedures for dealing with issues of harassment, etc. Did you find any such governance documents within Hockey Canada?
Yes, we did. I think we've detailed them in the report. We certainly also found that there were areas where as you say, the policy framework was lacking in our view, and we made specific recommendations in that regard.
Yes, and I did appreciate it. I thought that you did an excellent job of detailing the gaps that were there. The reason I'm so concerned is I would have expected, if there were gaps at that level, then at the Sports Canada level, where Sports Canada is funding organizations, that they would have had some policy requirements as well. And so I did go to the government's website and did print out quite an extensive policy document from Sports Canada, but there is nothing in here that talks about actions, codes of conduct to prevent abuse, how to address the situation if someone comes forth with an allegation of abuse. And when I see the numerous sports organizations, I mean, we've heard about swimmers and gymnasts, and I mean, there's quite a list here that Sports Canada is funding, and I think it's important to fund. But in order to make sure that this rampant abuse that is happening across all of these organizations is ended, do you have some recommendations for us about what ought to be done at the Sports Canada level and in terms of the auditing of those who are funded to ensure that we have compliance and we have a safe environment?
As you'll understand, my task was to assess the governance of Hockey Canada, not to do a review of Sport Canada. I had more than had my hands full in 89 days to do Hockey Canada, so it was not practical to go farther, and I had no mandate to do so. I did set out in the report some of the current aspects of Hockey Canada's involvement in these issues because I wanted to set out the full legal context within which the governance of Hockey Canada has to be assessed. I noted some academic writing to the effect that Sport Canada perhaps ought to play a more robust role. And I did note the sorts of conditions that are included in the contribution agreement, which is their main tool or behavior modification tool. I think, and I also learned in the course of my review in that context that that Sport Canada is in the midst of revising, as I think the minister and others officials indicated in their testimony before you. But I'm in no position to say what is the best or what they ought to do. I simply tried to note what the existing situation is and what is said is being done as we speak.
Thank you. One of the other concerns that I had throughout this, I had previously been involved when the sexual misconduct in the military was being reviewed. And it was troubling to learn that, incidents from 1994 and carrying on and on and on and on without really firm action being taken. And even from the time when the newest allegations came out, it took almost a year of getting the runaround before we had a new minister put in place, and I believe she's going to provide an update today on what is happening there. So in terms of the Hockey Canada history, it seems to me there were a number of payouts for assault from the different funds, the $8.9 million in 1989, $7.6 million paid for 9 other ones out of the National Equity Fund, 12 additional claims through the insurance fund. And during all this time, it didn't appear that there was any action taken. Is that a fair statement from your review of their activity?
I don't think it's entirely fair because certainly there were programs both at the local level and assisted nationally. Whether, of course, they were robust enough or adequate is a whole other story. But I think it would be unfair to say that nothing was done.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll move now to the Liberals. Mr. Housefather for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, thanks again, Justice Cromwell. I have a different line of questions, but before that, there was one section of your report that intrigued me that I just want to delve into with you for 1 second. One of the problems that, I think I identified that I was the most disturbed about was Hockey Canada's failure to minute important board decisions, whether taken in-camera meetings or otherwise. And I noticed in your report you said that wasn't not necessarily good practice, although you did note that there may be occasions where it might be appropriate. And I can't imagine anywhere where it would be appropriate for a decision of a board to settle a case not being minuted. Like I can't see how that could be appropriate. I mean, certainly information could be excised related to the identification of a person, but can you explain where you would think it would be appropriate for the board to actually make a decision to pay an amount to anyone and not to minute that to have a future record of that decision?
No, I think the focus of my concern was on making sure that the minutes were consistent with any legal obligation that the organization had undertaken. And also, of course, one has to be cautious, as you would well appreciate, with solicitor and client privilege issues, because presumably the board is going to be acting on the basis of legal advice. So I regret if I gave the impression that I thought there'd be occasions where no minuting would be appropriate. I think I was trying to focus on some of the nuances of the practical difficulties of minuting, but as a general principle, I think you and I are exactly on the same page.
Yeah, no, I agree. That's why I was just, I didn't understand exactly how it was drafted then, because obviously, of course, they don't need to explain why they made that decision based on, the advice of their lawyer that could be given in private. I just wanted to make sure we all agree and that no organization in the country thinks after reading the report that it's okay not to minute decisions to settle a case. So can I ask you another question? I was intrigued by one of the things that you wrote in the report. Basically, it related to where you talked about the people responsible. You wrote, it is also time for other entities and stakeholders to reflect on their own roles and responsibilities. Some who have been quick to announce their loss of confidence in Hockey Canada have been slow to acknowledge their own past contributions to its troubles. The underlying causes of the current crisis are not of recent origin. The members have controlled who is on the board. Could you just sort of speak to that and sort of say why you put that in there?
Yes, absolutely. I think if you carry on the same area in the report, and it's in the introductory comments, it's page 13 of the English version. I apologize, I don't have the reference to the French in front of me, but as you'll see, I said in that section that it certainly was not my role to point fingers or assign responsibility, that the purpose of getting into this was to encourage all of the interveners, all of the stakeholders, sponsors, members, everyone, Sport Canada, everybody concerned about the health of sport in the country, to work together to solve some of these very tough systemic issues. So it very much was not a finger pointing exercise. It was a plea for people to work together on these systemic problems.
And agreed. I just wanted you to be able to get that out there on the record, and I think that's a very important thing. We all have to pitch in from all of our vantage points. Another thing that intrigued me is you mentioned in the report that Sports Canada essentially may have missed governance problems at the organization, which is likely to be true. But I do note that in its grades, for example, Canada.
1 minute.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Sport Canada gave a grade of 1 out of 5 to Hockey Canada, for example, for conflict of interest. So they did flag certain things that were of concern. Could you talk just briefly, because we only have a minute left, about the Sports Canada process and how, I know you, Ms. Gladue asked and you said that it's not wasn't your purview, but what can we do as a committee to give guidance to Sports Canada and how it can improve its process based on what you learned with respect to Hockey Canada?
Well, far be it from me to advise parliamentarians on how to carry out their functions. But let me simply say that the whole nature of regulation of sport and tying the issue of regulation to funding is a very important issue. It raises a lot of issues about resources to carry out a regulatory function. Certainly, we heard from individuals that they would favor a more robust regulatory environment. As I say, that was not something I felt competent to give an opinion on, but we certainly heard that from a number of sources.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Housefather. We move to the block. Mr. Lemire for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Cromwell, allow me to come back to the makeup of the board. Should the nomination committee have taken into account certain conflicts of interest with certain candidates, for example, with close links to the gang rape allegations in 2016 or 2018? Answer. I don't want to comment on conflicts of interest because I am not aware of the facts. Thank you. You were a judge in our justice system. You have ample experience. There are a number of times in the report where you name leaders, including Mr. Glenn McCurdy at Hockey Canada. Do you believe that in light of all the facts that you have shown, that it is possible to have a collective action, a class action lawsuit against Hockey Canada? Would it make that possible? Answer. I will make absolutely no comment on civil liability. Thank you. We've checked, and it seems Hockey Canada did not confirm that it will comply with Sport Canada. Do you still repeat the same recommendation that Hockey Canada must align itself with Sport Canada's code of conduct? Yes. Question. Did you see that the funds that was used money from the funds was used to buy condos? I have no knowledge of that. 1 minute remaining. Thank you. Okay, I wasn't expecting such short answers, so thank you very much.
You're done?
Yes.
All right, Peter gets the extra time, right? We go to 2.5 minutes to the NDP and Mr. Julian.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I thank my colleague from the Bloc, but I hope that you will add 1 minute for my time.
Justice Cromwell, I wanted to come to an issue that has been festering out there. First asked Hockey Canada about this in the month of August, which is the issue of the compensation given to board members. A whistleblower indicated luxury lunches of $5,000 for a board of 12 people, luxury hotels, fine jewelry, $3,000 each, championship rings provided to board members. We finally received an answer about the jewelry, that the whistleblower is correct on the rings. For the luxury dining, the $5,000 board lunches, we have never received a response from Hockey Canada. And you point in your report very clearly that it is important that that you recommend that the board not be compensated. But what is your feeling about this type of compensation that the board has received? Did you come across these examples? Any confirmation of these fairly significant amounts, particularly when we talk about hockey parents across the country who scrimp and save to put their daughter or son into Hockey Canada programs? It seems a bit rich what the allegations are in terms of board spending. Did you come across this? What is your reaction to this? And is this why you were suggesting that it is important the board not be compensated?
Big question. I'll try to be as succinct as I can. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, I was certainly not engaged in any kind of forensic audit, and I was not engaged in any review of at the level of expense policies of board members. So I really can't be of much assistance to you on that. What I can say, though, at the more general level is that it's important for a not-for-profit organization to have a robust policy framework so that what is permissible and what isn't is transparent and known to all directors. This particular issue did not play into my thinking about the advice I gave that the current directors not put their names forward for re-election.
Thank you for that. I also
Very
like to
short question. Very short.
Well, I still have a minute to Mr. Chair.
Well, no, I got 2:33 here, but go ahead.
Thank you. You cited the meetings of Canadian Heritage on July 26th, talking about Sports Canada not having a process that allows it to verify if the SCOs abide by the obligations set out in their contribution agreement, and quote a member of the committee saying, as long as the organization says that it did everything it was supposed to, it gets the funding. What is your opinion on the importance of the federal government actually playing its key role of oversight and verification, national sports organizations, including Hockey Canada, so that they have to put in place and implement these policies?
As I mentioned in a response to an earlier question, and I think you're a bit modest, Mr. Julian, because I think it was you that I referred to in that passage of the report. But as I mentioned, of course, I was not there studying what would be the best regulatory model for sport in Canada at the governmental level. What I did was try to set out the existing legal context and also set out some of the information we had about what was coming. The role of government as a regulator in sports is a very complex legal issue in a federation, as you would appreciate, and also has a lot of resource implications. So I can't really offer you any specific advice other than to say that we heard from various sources in the course of our work that there was a real interest in Sport Canada having a more robust regulatory role.
Thank you. We'll move on now to the Conservatives and Mr. Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll take some of the time, but I'll split a little bit for you. I know you've substituted into chair today, and I will give you a little time at the end of my time. Thank you. Thank you, Justice. Really appreciate you being here today and your obviously extensive knowledge of what you've written about. I'm on page 201, where you've written, there is no doubt that Hockey Canada has been served by directors who are passionate about hockey, deeply committed to the organization's mission, vision, values, who donate large amounts of time and energy, often unreasonably large amounts, to the organization's governance. However, confidence is not only a matter of objective fact, but of reasonable perception, and there's an overwhelming perception on the part of the important stakeholders that the leadership of Hockey Canada does not deserve their confidence. So you've made a statement, you've talked about looking for facts, but you've made a judgment here about what people were contributing to an organization, but yet their contribution, though you suggested unreasonable, went astray. Can you give me some judgment analysis that you made to make that kind of statement?
Certainly. Number one, there was a lack of robust policy framework for many important areas of governance of the organization, and we I think set that out in quite considerable detail. Those are the kinds of larger picture governance issues that I think need a great deal of attention in the organization.
And it's critical in a sense when you're talking about culture. And culture is sometimes hard to define in fact. And so it's a lot of perception that you get also when you're interviewing people, talking to stakeholders. So can you go a little bit in the sense of what you found in that perception of the culture?
I don't really feel I'd be comfortable trying to talk about culture. The old saying, "Culture eats policy for breakfast." So I don't want to ignore it in any sense. But what I was trying to say in the passage that you referred to is that I feel that people were doing their best as they saw it at the time. With the benefit of hindsight, some of the wrong, and the approach to governance needed to be made more robust.
So in a sense, the culture then was maintained, and so what you heard from stakeholders, what you heard from people you're talking to, the culture that was developed by this board, then they lost in the sense of the confidence that people had, so the perception became the reality.
Yes, the only slight nuance I'd put on your statement, if I might, Mr. Shields, is that I don't think it's fair to say that 9 people created the culture of hockey or any other sport in this country. And that's why at the beginning of the report, I made that, I guess you could call it a plea for all of the folks to work together to try to solve this very tough systemic problem. I don't think it's fair, and perhaps you didn't mean to suggest that all of our problems with culture and hockey and other sports rests on the board table.
No, and I probably would agree with you, and that's not what I was suggesting. But in the sense that as you did a tremendous job and in depth and in a very short time, you found some other situations that led to people's lack of faith because of the culture in a particular board and the structure they were operating on.
Correct.
And so the recommendations that you were worked throughout your report
1 minute.
would suggest that there's things they should do and could do. But what I would like to ask you is, what was the most critical thing you believe that needs to be done so a new board going on will say, we've got a new piece of paper here that we've just reviewed, 200 pages. Somebody spent an incredible amount of time getting us a really good document as an agenda moving forward. What's the number one thing a new board that's going to be drinking from a fire hose as a whole group, what do they really need to pay attention to in your thorough analysis?
If I may, I'd like to say 2 things that I think are critical. One is who's around the table. And as you'll know, we made a lot of recommendations about the nomination process. Ultimately, that's the decision of the members who's around that table, and I don't want to usurp their role, but we made a lot of recommendations about that, and that's critical. Second is to have a much more robust policy framework that's transparent and will contribute to consistency of decision making.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. We'll move to the Liberals for 5 minutes. MP Koto, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Cromwell, for being here with us today. And this report, to get this done in a couple of months is quite the accomplishment. I think you're engaged in August, it said in the report, and you delivered it in early October, which is just an incredible feat. My first question is, in the middle of this a crisis, an organizational crisis that specifically related to an issue outside of specifically the governance structure, it was an issue that the entire nation was paying attention to. Why do you think, in the middle of such a crisis, there was value for the organization to do a governance review?
I guess as I tried to express in the report, my view is that governance is the foundation of everything else the organization can do. And I'd be the first to concede, of course, that you need more to have a successful organization that's carrying out its public interest mandate than a sound governance framework. But I do make the claim and truly believe that that provides the foundation for everything the organization does. It also became very clear that there were some important governance issues that the organization needed to address. And so my hope is that our work will be a very good investment for the future health of the organization.
There is a history of different reports and recommendations to the organization over the years. From your review of those recommendations and reports, that I know there's a couple of pages just listing reports, I think way back to the turn of the century. Did you find that there was an alignment between the recommendations either the board made or third parties made, and where the board was today from a governance perspective? Were there lost opportunities?
Frankly, I didn't try to assess the success or failure of previous efforts. I did study them in the hope that they would enlighten me in terms of possible recommendations. I think it's fair to say that the first significant review that I was aware of was focused on the new corporate not-for-profit corporation legislation that was coming into force. And so that was very much focused on those kinds of issues. And I think it's fair to say that the reviews that I looked at were very much more in the line of a normal consultant board relationship, whereas what I was tasked to do was to really provide an independent assessment, not simply to provide advice. But we certainly did have a look at earlier work and tried to take into account any insights that had been developed in the course of that work.
One of the roles of a board is to look for ways to mitigate any type of potential risk that comes to the organization. Over the years, we've seen complaints come in stemming from a range of issues, including, incidents of sexual assault, but also racism, allegations of racism. The board needs, boards need to respond by putting in place good governance structures that allow for the processing of those complaints, and to risk to minimize the risk to the organization, but also to do what's morally correct. Do you believe that there was a failure in putting in place from a governance structure the right type of systems in place to actually respond to these incidents, these complaints, these in some cases criminal activities that were taking place?
Yes, well, as you know, and I don't want to repeat it ad nauseum, but we didn't study specific responses to specific incidents. But as you'll know from the report, what we did say is that there was a serious gap in the policy framework for the organization about what funds could be used for what, under what circumstances, and setting out guidance for each board and staff members as to how these matters should be dealt with at the policy level. And we've recommended, as you know, that be done.
I guess my question is more specifically on the governance structure and policies. that the board put in place and that they had as part of their organization. Do you think that the board structure, the governance, the policies that were in place served the stakeholders well in regards to these responding to these controversial issues?
Clearly not. That's why we're here.
Yeah. Would you say
and
that there was a failure on their side to put in place that structure to allow for the proper processing of those complaints?
Yes.
Okay. Chair, do I have any more time?
Yeah, you do, about 20, 25 seconds.
Yeah. I noticed in your report you don't talk about racism or systemic racism, which I would argue systemic racism is finds its way in Hockey Canada. Why throughout this entire governance review was that issue not addressed at all?
I think the short answer is that, as I tried to explain earlier, my view is that sound governance is the foundation of everything the organization does. Clearly, issues of sexism, racism, homophobia, every organization has to confront that. And in order to do that effectively, they have to have a sound governance model in place. And so I was very much trying to work on that foundation. I wasn't trying to indicate how that would lead us in various important directions as the organization came to terms with those important issues.
Thank you for your time.
Yep, thank you, MP Koto. We'll move now to the Conservatives. Actually, I'm going to take the 5 minutes if you don't mind. Honourable Cromwell, thank you for all your work. I think around the table here, Honourable Cromwell, we were really disappointed right from the June when we first had Hockey Canada officials here. They were, as you know, very secret, talking about their funds, and then we find out they don't have only one fund, they have 3 funds. And you've done a very good job with your report here. But, going forward, you've mentioned the serious gap between the board and the staff. Would you recommend that Hockey Canada hire somebody that's not there today to deal with this gap that you have talked about for the last hour? The robust framework that is needed, the great deal of attention. It's obvious from what we've seen, there is nobody in Hockey Canada today, in our estimation, at least my estimation, is there today as an employee that would deal with the serious gaps that you have said in your report. Have you recommended to Hockey Canada they look outside the organization to deal with the gaps in your report?
Yeah, I'm sorry for that interruption. We're just having a little technical thing at my end. First of all, I think I have indicated in the report that the first job of what I've called the interim board of directors is to hire a new CEO. So the short answer to your question is undoubtedly yes, that a new CEO needs to be recruited. And it will be that person's responsibility to make sure that the rest of the staff of the organization can make up the sorts of people that are needed to carry out the mandate that the board has given them.
I think Canadians were shocked. This is a non-for-profit, and yet they have $153 million in 3 different funds. And you exposed the 3rd fund, which did not become transparent when Hockey Canada officials were here in June or even in July. The trust factor of Canadians in Hockey Canada, your thoughts on that? Because the not-for-profit in hiding funds, which, as we know today with the 3 different funds, transferring money from one to the other because you're scared that the insurance rates will go up or people will come forward with a request with more insurance to be paid on injuries and such, on sexual assault or harassment. That's troubling, I think, for Canadians. Would you agree?
Well, I'd refer back to my my second interim report to the board in early October, where I indicated that in my judgment, the confidence of stakeholders had been irreparably compromised. And that's why my advice to the board was not to stand for re-election when their terms expired. So I think I don't think I could really say that any more clearly than I did in that document.
Clean house, you were, your report mentioned that they had to clean house. The 9 people, I will say that they appointed yesterday. It's interesting because there is no representative from the Atlantic region. There is no representative now from Manitoba. There is no representative from Saskatchewan or Northern Territories or such. And you recommended up to 13. They took the first step on 9, but there is gaps that I see of the 9 that were appointed yesterday, saying that there is none from Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or the Atlantic region. Could you comment on that? We have 1 minute left.
First thing, I think it's important to remember that my recommendation was that an interim board be put in place with a mandate to act on recommendations promptly. But as you pointed out, my recommendation also was to expand the size of the board. A point of just, I guess, legal precision, the election of those directors will happen this weekend by the members. They have not yet been appointed as directors. They're at this point simply nominees. I don't want to comment on the specific slate, but I think it is fair to say that if the rest of the recommendations are put into effect, it should be much easier for the nominating committee to ensure geographical representation from across the country.
Thank you. That's 5 minutes. We'll go to the Liberals. Ms. Hefner.
Thank you, Chair. And through you, I'd like to thank Justice Cromwell for being here with us today and for answering questions. Maybe I'll just pick up on what my colleague MP Wall was talking about when it comes to the new board at Hockey Canada. How do we know that the process to bring in new leadership has been changed so that we do have more diversity in leadership at Hockey Canada?
Well, I guess we'll have to first of all examine whatever supporting documents they provide. I'm not in a position to assess how effectively my recommendations have been put into effect. My mandate ended on October 31st when I submitted the report. And so I'm not sure that I can be of much assistance in advising you as to how you can be certain that all of these recommendations are put into effect, other than by observing what the organization does.
I think I've heard concerns for some people involved that it's the same people at Hockey Canada making the same decisions and that nothing's really changing. I'm wondering what your perception has been watching the fallout since your report was released.
I certainly don't want to in any way usurp the role of the members in the election that's upcoming, but I feel comfortable saying that just looking at the bios of the people that have been nominated to the board, I certainly conclude that the nominating committee's made serious efforts to implement the sorts of recommendations that I made. I can't comment on individuals, obviously, but it's apparent that a serious effort was made to improve diversity, improve gender balance, improve range of experience, and so on and so forth. So it's clear efforts were made. It'll be for the members and others to decide if those efforts have been successful.
Thank you. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sort of, out of all your recommendations, which do you think are the most important for Hockey Canada to implement to see a brighter future going forward? Which of your recommendations would you say are the most important to implement right away?
Yeah, I have no trouble coming up with that list. Number one, the whole nominations process, I think, is vital, because if you don't have the right people around the table, it's going to be a problem. And second of all, to work hard on a transparent and detailed policy framework for the kinds of tough decisions that the board will have to make, and to provide that framework for staff that the board can monitor their work.
I heard you talk about not wanting to blame Hockey Canada for all of the problems with culture in hockey. I'm wondering if you would opine on how much of the toxic culture was supported or maintained by the culture at the top at Hockey Canada. So to what extent did the leadership at Hockey Canada perpetuate the problems with the toxic culture?
I'm sorry, but I can't offer any informed view on that.
Okay. I think I'm good. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
you still had a
thanks.
minute and a half?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
fine. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we'll go to the block for 2.5. MP Lemire.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Based on your experience with Hockey Canada and reading about the abuses and abuse within the sport, do you think that a judicial review would be beneficial to improve the health of the sport environment? Answer. The decision to invoke an investigation is a matter of public policy, and I have no expertise or opinion regarding that. Did you sign a confidentiality agreement with Hockey Canada? Absolutely not. Do you think sponsors were right to jump ship? It's really not for me to opine on that. Did you have access to all Hockey Canada's books? And were you able to see money that was exchanged between the Canadian Hockey League and Hockey Canada and the NHL? And were you able to see the detailed transactions between Hockey Canada and the National Hockey League? Sir, I am not an auditor, and I did not carry out any sort of legal investigation. Do you think it would be relevant to do so? However, I did request the documents that I felt were necessary for me to complete my duties in investigating the organization's governance. Do you think it would be relevant to make those transactions public, those financial transactions between Hockey Canada and different partners? For the purposes of my investigation, no. Mr. Chair, I would like to table a motion now. It was sent earlier to all political parties that in its study of safe sport in Canada, the committee use the new Sport Canada Code of Conduct for 2022-2023, which will...
You can't move the motion. You haven't been subbed in.
Pardon?
You can't.
Excuse me?
You haven't been subbed in yet. According to the clerk, you haven't been subbed in. We haven't heard from the block on you replacing shampoo, actually. You haven't been subbed in. Okay, so while you're
Parfait. On va vérifier.
kind of...
Okay, we will check on that.
So we got about 16 minutes, and I know it's a hard stop for the Honourable Thomas Cromwell and his team. We've got 2 5-minute rounds, Conservatives and Liberals, plus we have the NDP for 3. I'm going to give you the extra time that he had, Mr. Julian. Is that fine if we just go around the table? You know, Tim, you'll get your chance. Marilyn, you'll get your chance, and we'll go with the NDP right now. Meeting your time, Peter, but we'll start the clock fresh, and for 2.5 minutes, we'll have MP Julian, NDP. Go ahead.
You said 3 minutes.
I can afford that.
Okay, 3.5.
3. I'm giving you half a minute too much.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
C'est triste, Justice Cromwell.
Justice Cromwell, it is sad As you know, we are often reminded of the crisis in which Hockey Canada finds itself. This is our winter sport. We recently heard of an incident of violence in Drummondville. We are also reminded of homophobia and racism within Hockey Canada. This is a huge problem.
Increased concerns around homophobia, increased concerns around racism. Some of the news articles that have come out in the last few weeks have been profoundly disturbing. And so I know, Justice Cromwell, that you flagged the issue of the lack of diversity in amongst the board of directors. You mentioned that there is not a lot of diversity. In fact, your figures are very compelling. 87.5% of the 8 directors were white. Of the board that is stepping down. One of the directors identified as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, 1 director of South Asian descent. So we have on the one hand disturbing levels of homophobia and racism, on the other a lack of diversity in the board. Do you make a connection between the concerns that so many people have raised around hate expressed in hockey through Hockey Canada programs and the discrimination and the lack of diversity on the board?
I'm not sure that I'd feel comfortable talking about some sort of causal connection, but I would feel very comfortable saying that a more diverse board would be much better equipped to deal with the realities that are being faced. And of course, as we all know, it's not simply a hockey issue. It's not simply a sport issue that we have racism and sexism and homophobia in our society at large. So it's a societal issue. What I feel very comfortable saying is that the sort of breadth of diversity that I would recommend for the board would be better equipped to understand how to deal with those realities in the context of the governance of an organization like Hockey Canada.
Thank you for that comment. Now, the mission statement you mentioned on page 22 of your report for Hockey Canada is a positive hockey experience for all participants in a safe, sportsmanlike environment. Do you feel Hockey Canada has fulfilled that mission or that mandate? And if not, how critical are you of the fact that they haven't respected that fundamental mission and value?
I think, again, I have to go back to what I was trying to do, which was trying to help set up a firm foundation for governance for the organization. I was not there to assess their performance on every operational issue. I firmly believe that the sorts of governance recommendations that I've made, as I say in the report, would greatly assist the organization in fulfilling its mission.
Thank you. We'll move on to the Conservatives for 5 minutes. Ms. Gladue.
I believe Mrs. Thomas has a couple of questions, and then she'll give me the residual. Thanks.
Okay, Mrs. Thomas.
Thank you so much, Chair. My question to you, Mr. Cromwell. Again, you highlighted that the 2022 audited financial statements will be known on December 17th. So that's coming up toward the end of this week. In your estimation, would Hockey Canada, I guess I'm wondering if in your estimation, should Hockey Canada make those audits public?
Yes.
And do you believe, and why is that?
Because I think it's consistent with the COC standards for national sport organizations.
Mm-hmm. Why has Hockey Canada gotten away for so long without doing that, if that's the standard?
Well, I'm not sure gotten away is exactly the correct term. There was no legal obligation to do it. It's a standard,
but it is the
not
standard.
A legal regulation. And there are filing obligations. Why they chose not to do this, we did comment on in the report. And my advice to them is to adhere to that standard.
Now, this is the third full governance review that's been done and paid for by Hockey Canada since 2014. There was no change based on the first one, or very little measurable change based on the first one. There was very little measurable change based on the second review. Do you have confidence that we're going to see change based on this review?
Respectfully, I don't think it's up to me to have confidence or not in what they'll do with my recommendations.
I'll ask it this way then. Do you have evidence? Do you have evidence to suggest that the Canadian public will see measurable change based on your report?
What I can say is that my interim report was adopted by the members at a special meeting, that it's clear that the nominating committee has made serious efforts to go in the direction that I recommended, and it'll be for the members to decide on the weekend whether it wants to continue to go in that direction. So there are certainly steps that have been taken that are directly and promptly responsive to my recommendations.
I wonder how much of that has to do with the fact that sponsors pulled so much funding and that this organization was finally publicly shamed for their misconduct versus how much of that has to do with your report. But I'll let that question sit there. I just want to come back around just because I want to make sure that you understand that I'm requesting something in writing. And that is the question that I asked you toward the end of my time last time. I asked you if there was any evidence of Hockey Canada wanting to join OSIC. Before the Ministry of Sport imposed this obligation on them in order to have their funding reinstated. And you said that there was evidence, but that you didn't have those notes in front of you. I just want to make sure that I'm requesting a written statement with regards to this evidence.
I think I perhaps misunderstood your question. I apologize. There's no evidence before the Minister of Sport intervened that there was an intention to join. That is clear. And I believe I have that in the report.
Okay, because I'm going to give you an opportunity to correct the record then, because before you said that there was evidence that they had perhaps considered it, but that they had decided that they didn't want to because they didn't want their financial statements to be made public. Do you want to go back on that statement now, Mr. Cromwell?
I think I want to clarify it at least. I'm not sure that I was completely understood the chronology of the question. We have in the report the evidence of, yes, and I think we're maybe talking about two different things here, but if the question is, do I have evidence about the office of the Sport Integrity Commissioner, the answer is no, before the government acted to freeze the funding.
Okay, I'll let that sit there. I'll give it to my colleague.
Thank you, Chair. So two quick questions. First of all, on the transparency of financial reporting, I think you were clear that, with these three funds that existed, there was some concern that if people knew how much money was really there, that there might have been more claimants come forward. Definitely transparency will be important. I know that when it's removed, like it was in the first sitting of Parliament with C2, the financial transparency for Indigenous reporting was removed with some negative consequences. I think, is there a way of having the reporting on perhaps combining the way the funds are reported, that they are insurance and uncovered or uninsurable liabilities? Is that a way of reporting with transparency without necessarily dangling a carrot for others?
I think I'm out of my depth on that question, because how matters are reported on audited statements is a special skill of people who are trained in auditing. And as you'll see from the report, the organization was given some specific advice about these funds. I think, if I may speculate a little bit, it seems to me the next steps would be for the board to say, this is the policy direction we wish to move in terms of transparency, and then asking for, among others, their auditors for advice on how best to do that consistent with generally accepted accounting principles.
I fully agree. I think the federal government requires HR policies in place to ensure organizations indicate and educate on what's acceptable behavior, set out the timely follow-up that's required. third-party or court interventions, set out the sanctions for those who offend, and Sports Canada has to have a role in oversight to ensure that these fundamentals are in place with the ability to withdraw funding for non-compliance. Thank you so much, Justice, for your help.
Thank you, MP Gladue. Our final round of 5 minutes will go to MP Lewis from the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate that. And I want to thank Justice Cromwell for being here, for your time, and for your work on this report. You've probably been closer than any of us to this situation, so it's really valuable that you're here, and I appreciate it. Most of the questions, have been asked, and that just explains how important these issues are. So I don't mind saying it again. In your report, you found a third reserve fund. Now we know that there are 3 funds to date: the National Equity Fund, the Participant Legacy Fund, and then that undisclosed subpart of the Insurance Rate Stabilization Fund. When you interviewed Brian Cairo, the Hockey Canada Chief Financial Officer, in your report it says, Hockey Canada became concerned that this change in the financial statements inflated in the National Equity Fund artificially, which might signal a large pool of funds set aside for potential claimants, and this might increase likelihood of additional claims. We're talking about transferring money from one fund to another due to the concern about optics. You've said today that the confidence in that board was gone. Do you feel that Hockey Canada now understands how the level that this was at, and what level of confidence? I know you've asked this before. What level of confidence that you have moving forward that things would change, that these reserve funds would change, and what message do you think has been sent to Hockey Canada?
I really don't want to speculate or say what my personal level of confidence is about whether or not my recommendations will be put into effect. I was asked whether I had evidence that action was going to occur, and I related the steps that I know, like all of us know, have been taken. I really don't feel comfortable expressing a level of confidence one way or the other, because my task was to lay out what I hoped was a good path forward, and it's very much up to the members in the organization to decide whether it agrees with my assessment.
I do respect you saying that. Thank you. And I think what you said previously a few minutes ago was that some of the recommendations in your interim report were already taken under consideration. So hopefully that's a positive step. Earlier we touched on it briefly. What about the issues that players who are injured but not aware of some of these reserve funds? Hockey Canada stated that some of these funds were specifically set aside for non-insured injuries. With the lack of paperwork or the lack of information available, what message is being sent to these players who were paying into these funds but not able to access them?
I think a couple of things. One is, as I've said probably too many times already, one of the critical recommendations that we came up with was to have much more transparent and clear policy framework around these issues. I think I don't want to get too technical, but I think it's also perhaps worth noting that we can be talking about different kinds of insurance coverage. If, for example, when you have a moment, you have a look at the little chart that we have at page 150 of the report, ou dans la version française 163.
163 in the French version.
The form sets out the kinds of insurance that were in place according to our information. One of them is liability insurance. In other words, if someone does something who is at fault and might be held legally responsible at fault, that's the kind of insurance that would deal with that. We also note that there's accidental death and dismemberment insurance. In other words, that's the kind of coverage that would be available for people who were injured in a true accident, in the sense that nobody is legally at fault. And I think it's important not to sort of mix up those two kinds of coverage. And it's clear, I think, from what we've heard, that there needs to be greater clarity on the part of Hockey Canada as to what is available in both baskets and how the board is ultimately going to decide what's going to happen.
1 minute.
Thank you for that. 1 minute, sir. Thank you. You mentioned that transparency in policy is critical. Also, financial transparency is obviously critical. The public doesn't have access to Hockey Canada's financials, but the members do. And when you spoke, Hockey Canada said its members were free to ask directors of the management team anytime to get financial information. But according to a quote in your report, it said members can only raise issues if they're able to identify them. What were some of the issues regarding communications between Hockey Canada and organizations underneath Hockey Canada?
I think that, as you'll see from the report, the information that we got from members was a bit of a mixed bag. Some members felt that they were well advised, that they understood in general terms what these funds were for and what they were available for. Other members felt they were much more in the dark. And we also note, of course, that Hockey Canada is a national umbrella organization. It's got tens of thousands of people that sort of operate under that general umbrella up through their local and provincial organizations. So I think it's pretty tough to take the temperature of, collectively of how people are feeling about what they know. We discovered, as I say, it was a mixed bag, if I can use that expression, and we have recommended that further steps be taken to try to make sure that the information gets through and that there's a consistency of decision making.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. We're just going to wrap up the hour and a half. We just want to thank the Honourable Thomas Cromwell for your time. I know you had to get up fairly early in BC, and I would also like to acknowledge your associates that were with you today, Ms. Effendi along with Ms. Prince. So thank you to all three for your candid answers concerning Hockey Canada and your report, the Honourable Cromwell. I think it was very timely reading as we move forward to Saturday, what happens with Hockey Canada and their board. And I know they have 9 people nominated, but as you mentioned, they will decide on Saturday if, in fact, those 9 or others will join them around the board table. So thank you very much. We'll just let you go now. And I just want to ask Mr. Lemire, on your motion.
Je regarde si c'est moi ou Martin.
I'm verifying if it's myself or Martin. Madam Clerk, can you check?
Monsieur Champeau.
Mr. Champoux.
Mr. Champoux, do we have permission to distribute your motion to members around? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Monsieur le Président, voulez-vous que je lise?
Mr. Chair, would you like for me to read out the motion?
I would.
Que dans le cadre de
That as part of its study into safe practice of sport, the committee study the implementation of the new guidelines from Sport Canada,
Center qui entrera en vigueur
which will come into force in 2023. And to do so, number 1, the committee have the main objective of ensuring that the rules that the organizations put in place by Sport Canada bring on real change in the sport culture. 2, hold 2 sittings during the holidays to hear from Sport Canada for 2 hours and Minister Pascal Saint-Onge for 2 hours. And 3, that the committee ask to hear about consultations to renew Sport Canada's policy for the next decade, including strategic recommendations to follow and measures to be put in place for the implementation of the new Sport Canada policy 2023 to 2033. 4, all the documents be sent to the clerk of the committee and forwarded to members at least 48 hours before the two witnesses appear. And finally, that the committee share its recommendations with the House. The interpreter would like to note that she did not have a copy of the motion, so that was a resume.
Okay, so the interpreter didn't have a copy of the motion, but we all heard it. We'll go to Ms. Gladue first and then Mr. Biddle.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I like this motion. I would like to ask to clarify something. 2 meetings would be held after the holidays, but the exact dates were not given because sometimes witnesses are not available. Is that correct? Absolutely, yes. Also, I would like to clarify. I made a mistake because of a note on my page, but in point number 2, there would be 2 sittings after coming back from the holidays in January or February 2023. Perhaps that can clarify for Ms. Gladue. So we would leave that up to the witnesses' availabilities.
Thank you. Mr. Biddle.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I guess just to clarify, are we just continuing on with this in public, or are we moving to in camera? You had mentioned moving into in camera.
What do we want to do? Committee's choice, right?
Yes. Well, there's lots of chairs up there. Okay.
Madame la Présidente, vous n'avez pas votre micro.
Madam Chair, your microphone is not turned on.
Présidente, appel au règlement, Monsieur le Président, pardon.
Mr. Chair, Dr. Fry does not have her microphone on and interpreters are not able to work. Thank you.
Yeah, what Dr. Fry said is we'll deal with this now, then we'll suspend and go into committee. So, Mr. Biddle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I have a number of concerns with the motion. I guess it's my concerns that I've addressed, and I've addressed a lot of them in camera, and so I'll be very careful of what I say, but I've also been public with my concerns about the direction that this committee's heading. And it came back to a situation where after one of the meetings we had with Hockey Canada, I was scrummed, like many of us were, after the committee meeting. And one of the reporters asked me, what are your recommendations for Hockey Canada? What are your recommendations from this committee? What do you think the committee's going to do going forward? As I see, this is point 5 in the motion. And it was almost embarrassing to say we don't have any. We've heard from Hockey Canada witnesses, and we've, I think, been very good at showing to Canadians in a nonpartisan way that Hockey Canada wasn't an organization that could be trusted. And there was outstanding work by members of the media to amplify that and give us more information to go after and press Hockey Canada on. But we haven't even scratched the surface of problems in sports in this country. We haven't heard from experts. We haven't heard from academics. I know, and I don't know who else is in the audience, I know we have a representative from Gymnastics for Action in the gallery, and we're not even mentioning other sports. I know it's Canada, it's hockey, that's the sport that's most likely to get the attention, it's most likely to get the members of the media here to cover our committee meetings, which, with respect to them, can be occasionally dull. Not when we're dealing with Hockey Canada, but other topics that we've dealt with. But I think we owe it to kids to truly expand this. I don't know that any meeting that we've had, we can really say to ourselves, we've made sports safer for kids. And I think that was our goal. I think that's what all of us, when we started down this path and we heard about the horrific sexual assault we wanted to take action. And I don't want to speak for other members, maybe I'll just speak for myself. I wanted to take action, and the more we heard about it, we heard about the toxic culture in hockey. We heard about the issues in Hockey Canada, and we've gone in a lot of different directions in Hockey Canada, especially in relation to their governance, especially in relation to how they operate and reserve funds and so on and so forth. But have we made hockey safer for kids? I don't know. I guess we'll see what the new board does. But I don't know that I have any recommendations for Hockey Canada. And we just heard from Justice Cromwell, who made a number of recommendations, and who is a highly respected jurist, but ultimately has been paid by Hockey Canada to do this summary. I would love to hear from academics who study this, who have looked into Hockey Canada, who have looked into the hockey system in this country for decades, and have things to say and things to tell us. I think the CHL has gone almost completely unscathed from our view, and there's some serious problems there, having seen reports, having seen issues, and having heard evidence and stories about what's going on. Hockey Canada doesn't control them. Hockey Canada borrows those players for a period of time. And my recommendation, and I guess I'll stop talking because I see a number of others on the list, but let's go in camera, let's really figure out a reasonable study. Let's expand it so that we have opportunities to call witnesses, opportunities to really build this and have the minister appear. If we have a broader study, she has already appeared on the Hockey Canada issue, but I think in terms of the study that is Safe Sport in Canada, let's bring this forward. I think we need to have more than 2 meetings. I don't know, I'm not the minister's parliamentary secretary. I don't know if she's available on these days. Let's actually have a broader study, and let's protect kids. Let's talk about things like gymnastics and rugby and soccer and bobsleigh and all of the sports we're hearing about. Because this is a horrible incident. This is athlete on fan violence. And that's a terrible thing, and it deserved Parliament's attention, and I commend all of my colleagues for the incredible work that they've done on this. But most of the other stories we're hearing from the other sports are coach on athlete violence and harassment and torment. Why aren't we dealing with that? And why isn't that at the center of these motions? I truly think that we need to expand this, and this is my plea to members of the committee. Let's go into camera, let's expand this, call the minister as part of that study and Sport Canada officials, but let's also arm ourselves with the knowledge to ask those questions. Hear from academics, hear from, we're saying Sport Canada needs to do better, probably, maybe, but how? We're asking Sport Canada to do our work for us, to create a report, and then we'll critique the report and report back to the House of Commons. I think that's the reverse order. I think that it should be incumbent on us as members of Parliament to be asking those questions, bringing in those witnesses, and coming up with those recommendations. And I don't know that I hope there isn't disagreement, because this, like calling the minister, calling Sports Canada officials can be and should be part of a broader study on this. But let's hear from some of the other organizations as well, and let's actually do what we said we were going to set out and do and protect kids, because I don't think we're doing that, and I think we're falling well short of our goal. And I don't think that's the intention, and I don't want to suggest otherwise. I know the Monsieur Lemieux has been steadfast in his desire and push for changes in sport, but I think this is an opportunity that we can expand the study. I don't not step on any of the toes of the Status of Women Committee and actually have a broad study, now that we don't have any legislation in front of us, thank goodness, and actually do a more thorough job of getting to the bottom of this, giving opportunities for witness list, and really digging down into the problems with sport. So I'll cede the floor, and because I see other hands up, and go from there.
The motion to go in camera. Is that what you've moved?
I didn't move the motion. I'm hoping to hear from other
Well, because
members.
if you move a motion to go in camera, there's no debate, we just go in camera.
No.
I know, well, yeah, no, we vote on it, but that takes precedence over Martin's motion, right?
I didn't move it. I don't want it to appear that the government's trying to shut things down. I'd like to hear from my colleagues, but it is my request that others support that so we can really dig down into doing this and doing this.
So it's not a formal motion?
Not a formal motion.
All right, okay. Now, therefore, you've ceded the floor, so I think we have Ms. Gladue, and then we have Martin again, and then Peter.
Thank you, Chair. Absolutely, I think Mr. Biddle makes exactly the points of why we need to support this motion, and I'm not at all opposed to adding more time. I think, the intent to shine a light on what went on with Hockey Canada brought a lot more to light than maybe we were expecting. One thing that will be really important is this is going to be very similar to the sexual misconduct in the military investigations, where it was at Defense Committee at the same time that it was at Status of Women. And we had to be very clear what was the scope that the one was going to cover and what was the scope that the other was going to cover. And so I think we'd have to wait for the chairs to have that discussion. My suggestion would be that this committee would be more appropriate to look at the governance that is needed. What is the governance from the federal government's point of view down to Sport Canada point of view, and perhaps let Status of Women take a different direction, which may be the protection of survivors and some of the other things that go in place. But definitely, I think we can just agree that we are going to have at least 2 meetings. It's going to start next year. And then at one of those meetings, perhaps we could get an update from the chair, having had discussions with the chair of Status of Women, to see where we're going to go from there. From there, we'll know how many witnesses, who should we call, and that sort of thing. Thank you.
Martin?
Merci, Madame la.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I listened to Mr. Biddle earlier, and we all agree. We all have the same objective. I think that what Chris sees in this motion is something much more restrictive than it really is. But in reality, the motion is completely aligned with his arguments. The Minister of Sport tabled a sport policy that will be in place for a decade. The least we can do to be of service to the community, athletes in sports, is to make sure that sports policies are the most rigorous possible and up to expectations. We are not asking for a final report, but we think it would be entirely relevant and useful to be able to hold these meetings before this final policy be tabled. And it's under the purview of our committee, and this would allow us to ask the minister questions. But as Marilyn said earlier, we would also be able to add on meetings to be able to meet with other sport federations and associations. And we have been hearing from such organizations who will certainly be able to inform us greatly. I'm not asking for these 2 meetings to shut the book on our study in sport in Canada, not at all. I am looking for continuation, and if I may, Madam Chair, the more time goes by in this sports area, more and more, I think that there should be a special committee in the House of Commons, because there is so much to look into regarding sport. It is much more than what the Heritage Committee has time to do. So perhaps a special committee, and that might be a recommendation we could propose. So this is not complicated. We're not asking to cut time or to not hear from associations, sporting associations in Canada. Quite the contrary. We do want to hear from Minister Saint-Onge, and we want to receive an update on her sport policy. We will be operating under that policy for 10 years, I will remind you. We are very, very open, and this motion is aligned with the essence of this committee's work. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter?
Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I listened closely to Mr. Biddle and to Mr. Champoux. It seems to me that the motion is in line with what we are aiming to do. It really is time to invite the minister to return to the committee. We did have a discussion with the minister last summer, and now it is time to hear from her again at the beginning of the new year. This is also part of a broader study. And if we meet with her, we will be able to hear from her about the federal sport policy and find out more about what changes have been developing in the past months. I think it's also an opportunity for us to broaden the scope of our conversation with other federal sports organizations above and beyond Hockey Canada, and to look into this crisis of safety in sport that we are observing. So we would invite the minister to come back and to report on the measures she has taken since all of these staggering announcements and revelations have come to light. I believe it is the logical way to proceed.
Because I think it's good to have this report back. Certainly understand Mr. Biddle's concerns, but I think we can incorporate this motion into the larger work that we have to do. And so hopefully we can vote on it, get this in place, and then we, of course, will have that important committee discussion about how to build around the minister's appearance for the coming months. I think all of us, we work very effectively together, Madam Chair, under your leadership, and I appreciate that about this committee. I think we can do what Mr. Champoux suggests and what Mr. Biddle suggests, and build something that that will allow us to get to the bottom of things and where Canadians want to see us go, which is to keep pushing on the issue of safety in sports so that athletes, young athletes, regardless of what sport they're involved in, all athletes are in a environment that is safe, provides for the kinds of supports that we all hope that we would enjoy, and they can practice their sport without any concerns about some of the tragic consequences that we've seen in the last few years. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Peter, I think, is there anyone else who wants to weigh in on Martin's motion? Chris?
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. And again, there seems to be a lot of discussion and goodwill that we need to do all of these things, but no one seems to do this. I think this is, and I apologize, but unintentionally the lazy way to do this. That, I don't think the committee has the authority to demand a 10-year policy from the minister's office. And I'm happy to be corrected on that. Why aren't we the ones recommending where Sport Canada should be going, rather than a rushed report? If there is the authority, we'll have a rush report. We have the Christmas break coming, and so we're going to have a rush report and bring in the minister to then question her on the rush report that is supposed to set out a 10-year policy plan for Sport Canada. Why don't we hear from academics? Why don't we hear from experts, people with lived experience, what they want to see, rather than some officials rushed over Christmas to try to come up with a report that, because it's rushed, we're going to be critical of the minister when she appears, if she's free these days, because we found out about this motion today, I believe, during the meeting.
Rappel au règlement, Madame la Présidente.
A point of order, Madam Chair. If I may just interrupt Mr. Biddle. Regarding the content, Mr. Biddle is referring to a report that we're asking for. I'm not sure if the wording in the translation is different between the two definitions in each version, but what we want is a draft of policy for sports. The minister has already announced that in February she will be tabling a policy, and it will be in place from 2023 to 2033. So we're not asking the minister to create the policy. She already must table that policy. It's been announced. So we want to talk to her about what has been announced so that we can make recommendations to her before the policy is officially and formally implemented. So I just wanted to correct my colleague, Mr. Biddle, because we are not asking for a report to be created. We want to hear answers on what the minister already has to table in February. So there might have been some confusion in the wording of the motion. Thank you.
Chris, are you satisfied with Martin's explanation?
I appreciate the explanation. I think it goes back to my our PROC days. I don't know if anyone was on PROC and the Sims protocol and friendly interventions, and I do appreciate it. I always appreciate Monsieur Champoux' intervention. But again, at the end of the day, we're still in the same spot. We're calling the minister. Maybe she's available, maybe she's not. Maybe she's available for 1 hour, maybe 2. Again, why don't we kind of really put our heads down to put forward a proper study so that we can hear about it? And I take Ms. Gladou's point on not wanting to step on the toes of our colleagues at the Status of Women and the important work they're doing on sexual misconduct. But what we've heard goes well beyond, in various sports, goes beyond sexual misconduct. We heard from our colleague, Mr. Coteau, and like systemic racism in sport. Why are we so laser focused on this when there's so many people that want to testify to our committee to tell us what's going on? Desperate. I'm sure your offices are the same of mine, having heard from people who really want to hear before the committee. And we've called Hockey Canada now 5 or 6 times, and it's important that we did. Don't get me wrong. Again, the changes at Hockey Canada are directly, thank you, directly related to the work that. Okay, this is what I have. Directly related to the work of this committee and the work of journalists doing exceptional work out there, and so. If we're not, there didn't seem to be any support to go into camera, which I appreciate. It's good to keep things open, but I often find it's better when the cameras are off. The work can get done a lot quicker and bring us all together and try to figure out a study. So. I think, well, then I will have to then move amendments on the fly, which I don't really want to do. So I would, no, well, I would like to move, or I guess sub-amend the motion by removing section 1 and changing section 2 to allocate at least 6 meetings after the holidays to the study of safety in sport. and then remove the rest. And then have a third point to invite the Minister of Sport, Ms. Pascale Saint-Onge, to testify before the conclusion of the study. And that might actually get us closer to where we need to be and start hearing from experts and give the committee something really tangible to discuss, and then to meet with the minister and discuss those tangible things.
An amendment on the floor to Martin's motion. And what the amendment suggests is that we remove, that in order to do so, we remove 1. 2 allocates 6 meetings after the holidays on January and February, and including asking Minister of Sports to testify for a period of 2 hours with her bureaucrats, and that we remove 3 and 4. Now, any discussion on this amendment? Martin?
Merci, Madame la
Now,
Présidente.
we want to continue this in public, yes? We don't want to go.
Absolutely.
We've spent half an hour not deciding where we wanted to go. So let's focus, because we only have a half an hour left.
Sur le sous-amendement, Madame la Présidente.
Regarding the sub-amendment, Madam Chair, what I'm understanding is there might be a misunderstanding of the spirit of the motion that I tabled, or there could be a real will to stop the Minister of Sport from coming to the committee before her policy on safe practice of sport is published, or rather her policy for sport in Canada. In both cases, I think it's a shame. I believe that the motion we are tabling today is a motion that would let us to continue the work we have started. It's a very open motion that would potentially allow us to add in other speakers and witnesses. I wish to submit this argument to the committee, knowing what the minister has in mind for her sport policy will be extremely relevant to groups who would wish to intervene on that, stakeholders. Knowing where the government stands will make it possible for many more comments and opinions to be expressed by those concerned. And that is why we would then be able to make recommendations to the government. Inviting experts and witnesses before the minister told us about her policy would be backwards. Because after she tells us about her policy, we might wish to reinvite those same witnesses to speak again. It would be much more effective and efficient to hear from the groups concerned and the experts to ask them, does this address your concerns and your worries, etc. So I think the motion without the sub-amendment is complete, it is open, and it does not limit the committee in any way. Quite the contrary, and I will vote against the sub-amendment.
Including expanding it to 6 meetings.
Absolument.
Absolutely, including the entirety of the sub-amendment, because it's not because we're asking for 2 meetings that we need to limit ourselves to 2 meetings after they're done. It's a starting point, and we want to use those 2 meetings to find out what is contained in Minister Saint-Onge's policy that she will be tabling in February. So we can't wait until after she tables it. We need to hear from her before she tables it so we can have the chance to improve it with the opinions from experts that we can hear.
Chair. Certainly, I think there's probably more meetings that are needed, but I agree with Monsieur Champoux that, there's a policy that's about to come out. As you heard from my list, it's not rocket science. The government has a responsibility to make sure that organizations we're funding have HR policies that comply with the law. They educate on what's unacceptable behavior. They set out the timely follow-up required. They set out sanctions for those who offend, and there's a description of how Sports Canada Canada will oversee that through audit or other measures. And so, to me, I support the extra meetings, but I don't support the removal of the first part, which says, the objective of the committee is to ensure that the directions and actions to be taken by Sports Canada under the Canadian Sport Policy Renewal will result in a significant shift in the culture and mindset of sport. I think that's what we're trying to accomplish. I do agree that there's more discussion to be had about who we should hear from, but I think, this policy that the minister is going to roll out is certainly not going to be created on February the 1st. I think it's probably already in draft, and she can certainly speak to it, and that will give us an idea of whether there are gaps or areas that we would want to call more witnesses. And then, as far as the rest goes, I think, these are standard arguments that you make in order of reporting back to the clerk and making sure the recommendations make it to the House. So I will also not be supporting the sub-amendment or the sub put up by Mr. Biddle.
You ready to speak again? Yes, I am. I would like us to get this done before we rise. Just wanted before 1 o'clock, right? Good. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. It really is disappointing. Because again, we've said as a committee, we want to protect kids. And we want to hear from other groups. We want to hear from other sports organizations. Why don't we say right now, before we break for 6 weeks, that we're going to do that actual work? As opposed to showing the survivors and victims that, well, we'd like a few partisan jabs first, and maybe we'll get to you in the new year. Maybe, possibly, hopefully, maybe. Here's an opportunity to expand the study. I agree, the minister should come and report back to the committee. And I think that's a reasonable request by the opposition. And that's why I've included it in, or made sure that it stays within the sub-amendment. But the committee doesn't control the minister's schedule. And what if she's not available? We've adjourned today, or if we pass this motion today, history probably tells us we won't be here on Friday, though I have no inside information on that subject. And so, well, as Mr. Shields said, then we just canceled the meetings. And we don't have time to call any witnesses. We'll just come here and twiddle our thumbs and start from scratch and say, oh, we need to call these witnesses, when we can do the work right now and we can show to victims groups, to survivors that actually know what we care, that we want to actually look into this and do some work on it. And, oh yeah, the minister still needs to be accountable. That's the role of Parliament, to ensure that the executive is held to account. But I don't understand the rationale of refusing at this point to expand the study so that we can actually have recommendations. Because based on this, we have 2 meetings and then are required to report back. Report back on what? We didn't like it, then it just becomes a review of the minister's testimony. We still don't have any expert opinions. We still haven't heard from any victims, survivors, other organizations that are out there. And we're just going to report back what? I take the other members at their word that they will want to expand the study. Well, why don't we just do that now and get the work done so that over this period of time we can actually submit a list of witnesses so that the clerk actually has time to do so. We put a lot of pressure on her, and she does incredible work. But if we show up, I think there's consensus, unanimous consent on that point. But if the minister reports back that she can't attend these 2 days, the clerk just can't go start calling witnesses without a witness list. So we'll show up back on January 31st. We will then start this all over again to say, let's try to figure out the schedule. And may or may not be able to have witnesses appear on the Friday. And so we'll have burned 2 meetings when we can be talking to people who wish to express a concern to Parliament, who I'm sure have been calling everyone's offices to say they want to appear before Parliament, and actually do a study that looks and protects kids. And even if it's on hockey, we have touched just the tip of the iceberg on this issue of sport. That we need to do better. We need to do better, and I'm hoping that the members can agree that this is the opportunity, given the schedule, given that we probably won't have a Friday meeting, to actually get this done and set it out rather than do it piecemeal, rather than the minister's office saying, well, we don't have time, we may be able to do it another week, we may not be able to do it this week when we return back from the break. Then we just burned a couple meetings. And I guess there's a Status of the Artist Act study I guess we can probably dig into. I don't know what other business is before the committee that we can use at that point, but we'll have already burned 2 more meetings. So why don't we take this opportunity and show to those that are out there that we care enough to actually plan into the new year to hear from these organizations and people who have faced a horrific power imbalance. And again, it's not just sexual misconduct. There is harassment. There is systemic racism. There are issues with seemingly every sports organization we look at because there seems to be a monopoly. These organizations have monopolies over the sport, and we love sport, and few people question anything that goes on. So many of these organizations have never really been looked at, and I think it's really a good opportunity to have a plan. And this is an incomplete plan. I see Mr. Julian with his hand up. I'd really like to hear what he has to say. Even if it's, and just this as a suggestion, perhaps we can suspend, I hear from the other members, but hopefully suspend for a few minutes to actually come up with something substantive. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Before we go any further, I have 3 names down, and we are going around in circles. We are not coming to any conclusion, so I just want to tell the committee that I think we should come to a conclusion of some kind. Now, I don't see both ideas as being, they're interrelated, really. And I think Mr. Biddle made a point, and I just wanted to point out to the committee, we could ask the minister to come, and the minister may not be able to come, so then we're stuck. So, I think we need to come to a conclusion before soon. And I think I'm going to have to stop people if they keep making the same points over and over again, guys. Let's come to a conclusion here. So, Marilyn.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I want to say for Mr. Biddle to cast aspersions that other members of the committee don't care about helping children is not only not true, but unhelpful. Secondly,
Point of
this
order,
motion...
Yes, Ms. Biddle.
That's not what I said at all. I specifically said I think the intention of the committee is to look after children, but this motion doesn't do that. And let's just get to work on that. But I specifically said it is the intention of all the members to do that, but let's put our money where our mouth is.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle.
Apology
yes,
accepted. Thank you. This motion also invites the Minister of Sport and doesn't give her specific dates. We said January or February in this motion. And so it's the Minister of Sport. With the number of scandalous things going on in all kinds of sport, she would be too busy to come in January or February. I would suggest she's writing a policy on this. This is a priority, and she would definitely be able to come. And you'll see that in this motion, there is no end date on when the committee report has to be submitted. So we've said we are willing to add meetings, but we have to be clear what we will do in those meetings. We know what we want to do with the minister. We want to hear about what she's proposing in order to address the things that are going on. And I think that is where we can start, and then the committee can always add on.
We have 15 minutes left, and I really would like to see us come to some kind of decision before we leave. I don't know if we're going to have a meeting on Friday or not, so it would be nice to come to some kind of decision. So if everybody wants to make a new point, great. But I just really feel we're going around in circles, repeating the same things over and over again. Martin?
En fait, je répéterai pas parce que
I will not repeat anything because Marilyn has just said what I was about to say. This is one of the most important parts of the minister's mandate to date. And if it's important enough, I'm sure she will make space in her agenda because this must be a priority for her. And Madam Chair, we must vote on the amendment. I have nothing else to add.
Thank you. Martin, Peter, and Chris again. But I really want us to come to a conclusion here. I'm going to have to call the vote very soon.
Well, I appreciate that.
No, sorry, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I don't actually understand the filibuster. I have a lot of respect for Mr. Biddle. He's somebody who contributes a lot to this committee and brings a lot of wisdom and expertise. But in this particular context, I don't understand delaying the vote. I too am reluctant about the sub-amendment and the 6 meetings. I'd like to go beyond that. I think that is a discussion that we need to have amongst all the parties. But again, the principal motion that Mr. Champoux has moved forward makes sense to bring the minister back and to bring the officials back. We need to touch base with them in any event, and I think it is wise for us to do that as part of the broader study. Yes, reported the House that isn't, as I see it, a comprehensive report. I see that as something that allows the House to take knowledge of what the committee is doing. There is a lot of interest, not only from the public, but also from other parliamentarians and even other committees about the work that we are doing. I think touching base makes sense. I think that is our responsibility, and so I would suggest, if I could, of course, Mr. Biddle is master of his own destiny, but if he withdrew the sub-amendment, we could vote on the principal amendment. I do think that would give us time to go in camera for 15 minutes or so and start the discussions around the broader study and work that we need to do in February, March, April, potentially of next year, as well, Madam Chair, as touch upon the private members legislation that we've received as a committee. Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. That was the intent, but I don't know that we're going to get there. Now, Mr. Biddle, please be succinct.
Well, that's seldom what I am, Madam Chair, but I will do my best. I won't burn out the clock. This isn't a filibuster. I really, truly wish to convey my points, and I really don't think we're that far apart, and I truly don't understand the reluctance to actually say what the committee's plan is going forward, the reluctance to go in camera and hammer out a business plan, or even suspending for 5 minutes and coming up with a genuine plan. I do want to clarify my comments. I truly think the members of this committee wish to help kids. It just doesn't appear on this motion. And that's sad. And I hope we get there. But again, if the minister's not here on these 2 days, it's the motion doesn't say January and February. The motion...
Mr. Biddle has the floor. Are you raising a point of order? No? Thank you.
There's one day... Oh, sorry, this is a point of order.
I think it's a point of order because it's a clarification. I don't believe Mr. Biddle understands that the motion was amended to take away the specific 2 dates that are there and to say January and February, and that was accepted as a friendly amendment by Mr. Champoux.
But still, there's one left in January.
It's a point of clarification, not a point of order. Yes? Point of clarification?
I have 2 separate motions.
We now have 10 minutes left in this meeting.
Well, I have 2 separate motions. So is it the motion from with the email, or is it the motion that we received from the block?
Well, I have the motion from Canadian Heritage that was sent on Tuesday, December the 13th.
Email.
It's the email? Okay. Well, there's 1 day in January. Oh, come on. There is one day in January. We come back on January 31st. Anyway. This is not going where I want to go. I thought there would be collaboration. I thought there would be a desire to hear from other organizations rather than what I unfortunately think is a few partisan jabs. Like, why don't we call the minister at the end of our study rather than at the beginning, or if this is going to be a new change in the direction of the study? I don't know, guys.
All right,
this
I
is-
am going to have to call a question on this sub-amendment.
Madam Chair, I have the floor.
I know you have, Mr. Biddle, but I think you're making the same points over and over. But go ahead, keep making them, and we will come to no decision.
Well, there's no desire for there to be any movement on it. We heard from the members that they are willing to move, that maybe we will have an expanded study in the new year, but there doesn't seem to be any desire to actually put that into writing. So I don't know what that means going forward. And I don't know why there's this weird divide. We've worked so well together on this study to this point. And again, I'll let it come to a vote. I won't talk out the clock. I don't know that that's appropriate, but I've expressed my concern, and I've been begging for us, and I'll focus on my public comments, for the last number of months to actually do the work that we need to do to protect kids, and calling the minister in advance of a report where maybe she can attend, maybe she can't, is not protecting kids. So, thank you.
Thank you. Tim, is there something, we're speaking to the sub-amendment, or sorry, to the amendment.
Yes, no, thank you. I just wanted to understand a little better. In my experience, the ministers usually come at the end of studies, and I think that's quite helpful, isn't it? That to have witnesses come, and I seems to be reversing the order here. I'm just a bit confused. I don't have as much experience as some members, but I thought we would have witnesses and we'd have studies and then extend that, and then when the minister comes at the end, there's a bit of a chance to
Rappel au règlement, Madame la Présidente.
Point of order, Madam Chair.
Mr. Shampoo's motion suggests a specific study. Mr. Shampoo.
Non, je faisais juste dire, Madame la Présidente.
No, Madam Chair, I just wanted to say we're wasting time asking for explanations on something that was perfectly clear from the outset. We are asking for the minister to come give us a presentation on the draft of her policy that she will be tabling. We want to hear from the minister so that we can know more about what we're doing in our work. Before this policy is implemented, I think it's very clear. I think we're wasting time here.
I will call the question on the sub-amendment. Oh, sorry, on the, keep saying sub-amendment. I'm too used to C18. Okay, all right. I'm going to call the question on the amendment. Please, clerk.
Okay, so on Mr. Biddle's amendment to Mr. Shampoo's motion, Mr. Biddle.
In favor.
Mr. Coteau.
In favor.
Ms. Hefner. Apologies, I just need to... Ms. Taylor Roy?
Oui, en faveur.
Mr. Lewis?
In favor.
Ms. Gladue?
Opposed.
Mr. Shields?
Opposed?
Mrs. Thomas?
Opposed.
Mr. Waugh?
Opposed.
Mr. Shampoo?
Contre.
Mr. Julian?
Contre.
Six nays, 5 yeas.
The amendment is defeated, does not carry. And so we're going to go back to the original motion, unamended. Can I call the question? Yes, please, clerk.
Thank you, Dr. Fry. On Mr. Shampoo's motion, Mr. Biddle?
Opposed.
Mr. Coteau?
In favor.
Ms. Hefner? Mr. Housefather? I'm sorry. Ms. Taylor Roy?
Opposed.
Mr. Lewis?
Against.
Ms. Gladue?
In favor.
Mr. Shields.
In favor?
Mrs. Thomas.
In favor.
Mr. Watt.
In favor.
Monsieur Champoux.
Pour.
Monsieur Julian.
En faveur.
Seven yeas, 4 nays.
Mr. Shampoo's motion carries. And so we have 5 minutes, and I think we could go in camera for those 5 minutes. No, it's too late. Do we have any time after that?
It takes 5 minutes to go in camera.
So,
It takes 5 minutes to go in camera.
so do we have any time extra? Or we start to stop hard at 1? Okay, we have a hard stop at 1. So I guess we will move forward. Yes, Martin?
Madame la Présidente.
Madam Chair, since we spent more time than expected debating the motion, I would respectfully suggest that we hold a subcommittee meeting before we come back in 2023 to discuss the topics that we would like to get into in the weeks thereafter, which we could have discussed today. So we could hold a subcommittee meeting when we first come back. Perhaps in the last weeks of January that the Heritage Committee meet to plan the schedule.
All right, the last week in January, you're suggesting, Martin. Anybody opposed to this suggestion that the subcommittee meet? Any opposition? I see none, so we will...
A point of order, Chair.
Sorry, Mrs. Thomas.
Thank you. Chair, I just wanted to clarify what the proposal is in terms of being the last week of January. Are we talking about the first week that Parliament is back in session?
When Parliament is not in session, we're talking about the last week in January. Sometime during the last week in January.
Okay, I believe that might be difficult for some members due to caucus meetings that are taking place. And so I might suggest that in lieu of our first meeting back on that week when Parliament resumes, in lieu of that meeting, perhaps the Planning Committee should meet instead. This is common practice in other committees.
Well, we do have a motion on the floor, and I think no one opposed it. You've opposed it. So shall we call a question? Yes. Call a meeting. I don't know when we can call that. You're going to have to, the clerk is going to have to tell us when she has time and resources, and we could be in touch with everybody, if that's okay.
Is Mrs. Thomas moving an amendment?
Okay, sorry, I can't hear you.
Is Mrs. Thomas moving an amendment?
Are you moving an amendment, Ms. Thomas?
Madam Chair, I wasn't aware that it was an official motion. I thought it was simply perhaps just could be a friendly conversation, and so I was just wanting to offer it. I guess if it is an official motion, then yes, I suppose I'm offering a sub-amendment, which would be to say that we take the first meeting that would be scheduled when Parliament resumes, and instead of holding a full committee meeting, we hold a planning committee meeting.
That's really, it's not a sub-amendment, that's an entirely new motion. Mr. Shampoo.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam Chair, I was tabling it more as an open discussion, and I appreciate Mrs. Thomas's suggestion. I know people do have certain obligations before Parliament comes back, so I would like to clarify my suggestion by proposing January 31st for the subcommittee meeting. It's a Monday, so I think that would be a good day for us to get together. And hopefully after that meeting, we will have a working plan. So January 31st, if that works for everyone.
Any opposition to January the 31st? Yes, Chris?
Not opposition, it's just the schedule's going to change, so we may not be meeting on January 31st. So just our first scheduled meeting back, be the subcommittee.
All right, the first scheduled meeting back being the subcommittee. Is there any opposition to that? Hearing none and seeing none, I think that we are going to do that, and we will hear from the clerk, or I will hear from the clerk with regard to this, when this is going to be, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and we will contact the members of the subcommittee to attend. thank you very much. It being 1, I declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you all. And I would like to I would just like to ask the committee to stay. I carted with great care.